Hello, my name is Elena Reyes. I'm a woman, a mother, a grandmother, a psychologist, and until very recently, a professor until I retired. I would like to take a few minutes today to share with you the importance of being engaged and not leaving anyone behind. To give you context, this is my story. I grew up in a Cuban community, as an immigrant community in Miami in the 1960s and 70s. My family had arrived right before the revolution when immigrants had to have had granted permanent residency in order to live on U.S. soil. So it was a time when seeking U.S. citizenship and voting was not on a high priority list in my community. More important was to put food on the table and to teach the cultural values that were supposedly going to help us when we returned very soon to Cuba. Unfortunately, that time never came. So as a first-generation college student, I was somewhat confused when my advisor had a conversation with me about becoming a citizen. There were certainly no significant bureaucratic hurdles for me. I had been to American schools my entire life, and I certainly had the language. And so the basics of US government, taking a test, doing the logistics of becoming a citizen just were not an issue. The only hurdle was the one that had long been implanted with the idea that I belonged somewhere else. It was in discussions with my advisor that I started to question this. Elena, he said, one day you may have children and you may want to say something about what happens in their community. You will not be able to do that if you cannot vote. You need to consider citizenship for that to happen. And so it was that coming toward the end of my senior year, I became a US citizen and cast my first vote for Jimmy Carter. Many years later, I wish I could tell you that it's only very few, perhaps more recent legal immigrants who do not vote. But we know that that is not the case. More people voted in our last presidential election than had voted in the previous 120 years. And yet there were 80 million people, US citizens in this country, that chose not to vote. Why are we then amazed when we see basic rights being turned back? How can we have a democracy if we as citizens are not engaged? Today, the importance of the women's movement remains the same, making sure that women are treated as and have the rights of human beings. Most importantly, it is the recognition that there are many girls and women who do not have access to their basic human rights in this country. Therefore, it is our responsibility to become engaged, to look behind us, and to inform and lift those weary behind us that their vote does count. Let me offer some examples of the importance of voting in the lifting of the rights of women. A few years ago, I was running an after-school group. It was a support group for high school girls whose parents were agricultural workers in a small rural community. When discussing relationships, I dared to ask how many of them expected to be hit by their husbands if they were married. Of the 10 girls in the group, 9 raised their hands. In the women's clinic in another small rural community, over and over, we see women coming in with illnesses, including urinary tract infections, and result of not having enough hydration and time to use bathroom as they harvest the crop. This is the food that all of us eat. The fear of walking along among the harvest is real. A rapist could be, and often is, hidden in the fields. And these women do not have recourse because they need their work. Access to the reproductive care eludes many of these women. I remember the young woman who, after a lifetime of abuse in her own country, was granted asylum in the US. Knowing no one and accompanied by her son, her 6-year-old son it was, she found her way to a small rural agricultural community. She found a place to stay with another single woman who had a child of her own and who had promised to care for her child so that this woman could go out and find work. And so, setting out by foot in the dark before dawn the next morning, she was raped. Too afraid to tell anyone, including the authorities, she went without help until 2 months later, when she showed up at the clinic pregnant and very, very ill. The only clinic around was a federally qualified health center. There, you are unable as a provider to tell patients about what all of their healthcare options are. Having to go outside the system, moving mountains, and finally finding a Planned Parenthood clinic 50 miles away, my trainee was able to enlist their help, from a cell phone to transportation to the abortion that, while she did not want it, she desperately, because of her health, needed it. So becoming engaged is not because I do not know my rights or because I do not have the knowledge and skills if confronted with a domestic violence situation, or because I do not know my rights in the workplace, or that I do not have the money to go out of state should I need to access healthcare. But there are millions of women in this country that need for you and me to become engaged. We need to vote and others to vote so that all of us have the rights that a human deserves. I hope you call a friend tonight, volunteer tomorrow, and vote in November. Our fight for ourselves and our sisters carries on.